So I was showing you that flyer over there, which is really the first women's action at Seneca, and this is kind of exactly how it started. A bunch of us had been involved in the Women's Pentagon actions in 1980 and 81. We had kind of identified strongly with the emerging feminist anti-militarist movement at that time. And a bunch of us had gone to the Pentagon not quite knowing what to expect, and there was an incredible amount of excitement and energy and a sense of kind of a lot of women coming together for the first time, and with a similar set of politics. At the same time, the gay rights movement was really in its infancy, and so there were a lot of us who were also lesbians who were drawn to this the anti-militarist movement at that time. And so it kind of became a place where it was also very safe for us to be out and political and very defiant about that, and it kind of all came together in that group of women. There were a number of feminist anti-militarist conferences at that time by a group called Women and Life on Earth, or Women for Life on Earth. I remember, I think they were based out of New England, and we went to these amazing conferences, and we talked to each other about what our political agendas were and what we thought we could accomplish. Around that same time, I was living in Rochester, New York, and I worked at a very small, I had a bunch of different jobs at that time, and one of them I worked part-time as a typesetter at a little local newspaper in Rochester called City Newspaper. And it was a really fun job because I'd go in after the regular day shift and I'd do typesetting at night, and nothing was computerized then. They had these kind of big typesetting machines, and I went in there one night, and the next week's, it was a weekly paper, and the next week's story was laid out, and the galleys were all laid out on the big news tables, and I'd always go in and glance at what the story was. And I realized they were about to break this story about the Seneca Army Depot and the fact that there were weapons stored there, and in this sleepy little town, in this sleepy little depot that nobody knew about. And I was like, wow, holy cow, these things, you know, are really close to us. They're sitting right near Rochester. It's not a very well protected site, and it looks like, if this guy's right from the investigative reports that he's doing, that there some pretty scary stuff being stored in this sleepy little town. Now, at that time I was part of this group called the Upstate Feminist Peace Alliance, and of course I told them, and we got very interested in doing something to, in the past we'd been protesting at the Pentagon, we'd been protesting kind of on a national scale, and you know, in those days the philosophy was always, you know, act globally and locally, so we decided we'd try to do something about what was going on in our own backyards. So the Seneca Army Depot quickly became a focus for the actions we were doing as part of this Upstate Feminist Peace Alliance, and the group had a Rochester chapter, an Ithaca chapter, and one other, Utica or Albany? Syracuse, right. So there were the three groups, and we would meet together occasionally, and we'd do actions in our own cities occasionally, and then we kind of hooked up to do this one-day event on May 15th of, I think it was 81 or 82, and we all started out in our hometowns, and we did these great street theaters along the way. Ours was this thing called the Missile America contest, where we did a beauty contest with women all dressed up as missiles, and we got kicked out of several shopping malls doing this. And then I know that the Ithaca caravan stopped at a couple of places, and the Syracuse stopped at a couple of places, and we met up at the depot, and we had a big rally there, followed by a big picnic at the state park, which was kind of around the other side of the depot next to the lake. And that was the kind of first action, big action at Seneca that I remember, and I think that by then peace camp planning may have already started. I think by then we'd already shared with our friends in New York and Philadelphia that we had heard there was some, I think the WILP organization, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, was very interested in funding peace camp in the U.S. There had been one at Greenham Common, and so a bunch of us joined forces. There were these little local groups also called the Women's Pentagon Action Groups, the women who had been involved in Women's Pentagon Action. So we started meeting regularly about having a peace camp, and because we were doing this action at Seneca, people got very interested in that as a possible location. In retrospect, I think it was kind of an odd and interesting choice because it's really in the middle of nowhere. If you've been, well, you've been there, you know that. But to me, in particular, it was very meaningful. I grew up in a small town just, I think about 30 miles from there. Landscape really similar to the landscape of the people at the depot. When they came out and protested against the peace camp, I felt like I understood where they were coming from because I'd grown up pretty locally. And I think I was one of the few people that actually grew up kind of right in that same environment around peace camp. I remember driving by the depot when we were kids because they had a strain of albino deer there that was kept inside. They kept having more and more of these albino deer. It was like some kind of recessive gene, but the deer were all confined within the depot because of the fence. And so we'd always drive by there and think how weird it was. And then later on we'd always say, oh, it's because it's the nuclear stuff is there that's turning these deer white, which I don't think was really true in retrospect, but I was really familiar with that area and that landscape. And it was really hard when we first started getting women from New York City or Philadelphia involved. We would call it the Seneca Army Depot, and they would call it the Seneca Falls Army Depot, because they knew Seneca Falls, because in their mind Seneca Falls was on the map, because obviously the Women's History Museum was there. It was the birthplace of a lot of women's suffrage, and they liked the idea of making this historical connection. And I think a lot of them, when they set up the march that happened the first year of peace camp from Seneca Falls to the peace camp, had no idea what they were getting into as far as the actual number of miles away that they would have to walk to get. The Seneca Army Depot was not in fact in any town or any city, and it wasn't near Seneca Falls. It really is a sleepy little depot out in the middle of nowhere. Our other big concern at the time was employment. We didn't see that the Seneca Army Depot had any commitment to the people of that region other than kind of using their remote land as a wasteland. And we were worried about what would happen to the folks who were working there and would lose their jobs, since it was one of the only big employers in the area. And in fact, as you know, a few years later, the depot shut down, and it didn't care at all about the people they employed, and they just said goodbye to them, and that was it. People who grew up in the area had been stationed there in the military in World War II. The lake itself, Seneca Lake, is really, really deep, and so they had an underwater submarine training facility there. And so there were, friends of my family who were in the military who knew that as a military training site. But other than that and the deer, it was just this kind of place you would drive by on your way to Ithaca, and it went on for miles and miles. It was just a huge fenced-in place. Nobody talked about there being nuclear weapons there until this newspaper broke the story. So I think everyone understood there were weapons there. I don't think they understood that there were possibly nuclear weapons there. And that really was the big concern. I mean, talk about an unsafe place to store nuclear weapons, that would be high on the list. Although because of peace camp activity, they did have to go in and build new fences. They did actually strengthen the exterior fencing around the depot and stuff like that as a result of peace camp being there. It turned out through a weird set of coincidences that one of the women in the Boston peace camp movement, her father was a kind of parts and materials buyer for the Pentagon. And so he told us really early on, before the first year of peace camp, that they were mad at the Pentagon because they were having to pump so much money into reinforcing stuff at Seneca because we were putting the national eye on that location. I helped organize the second one, not the first one. The first one I was, I think, barely out of college, and I went by myself as a participant, and because I believed in the vision statement that they had and their mission and what they were doing.
Had you done actions prior to that?
No.
So that was the first one in 80 was your first?
Yeah. And it was a hard beginning. I mean, I don't know if you know that story, but we were all thrown in jail for 10 days. So it wasn't your, I mean, we went down there expecting that maybe we would get held overnight or something. And so it was it's probably the worst thing they ever did was put us in jail together for 10 days, because it's really those 10 days, a lot of the women involved in those 10 days were also the women involved in peace camp and lots of other anti-militarist activities. And what it really did was give us 10 days to get really close and kind of form very strong bonds and commitments, and that fueled a lot of activity. It fueled the next year's Pentagon action. Some of those women the second year actually went to jail for 30 days. Most of us were put into a big holding pen in the Arlington detention center. Was that right? Yeah. It was a big gymnasium, and they put us in there, and it was pretty ugly. But you know, there were lots of things that happened in there that were, you know, classic civil disobedience things. You know, they tried to there were some women who weren't eating. They tried to remove them after 5 days. We made a big circle around them. We wouldn't let them take them out. They took them out forcefully. It just was a really big kind of amazing bonding experience for those of us who went through that. And I think it made a lot of us feel very much stronger in our convictions. And there was a ton of homophobia too. So we were, you know, also kind of really bonding around being lesbians. And there were a lot of women who were afraid to be out, and saw some of us that weren't afraid. And again, you have to remember, it was really not a time when a lot of women were out, at least, and not getting shit for it. I mean, it's nothing like the liberal times we live in now. Well, it helped us build a vision. It helped us understand what it meant to be an anti-militarist and a feminist at the same time. It gave us, Pentagon action really was an incredible model for how to do a large-scale kind of enactment. I don't know how familiar with it, but there was theater, there was a vision statement, there were pieces of it wasn't just like show up at a demonstration and shout and wave flags. You know, there was a whole theatrical piece to it, and a lot of us had aspired to that level of theater and creativity and just plain fun as we went on to do other kinds of actions. And we did a lot of activities during that period of time. There were the 2 Pentagon actions. We did a Wall Street action. We did protests at the White House, protests in New York City, and demonstrations in Washington, D.C. And then that was just the anti-militarist work. A number of us were working in other areas at the same time. Big rallies against the Ku Klux Klan in Buffalo, rallies against the Klan in Boston, rallies against we did a lot of work around Central America and what was going on in El Salvador and Nicaragua at that time. So we had a pretty broad sensibility that got broader the more contact that we got through doing the anti-militarist work and moving from it being a kind of national or local issue to understanding the kind of international consequences of militarism and that sort of stuff. we also had people, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the first peace camp in the United States was here in the Puget Sound region. It was called the Puget Sound Women's Peace Camp. And we had women from the first Seneca, this action at the Seneca Army Depot, who came out here and actually started the peace camp out here. Yeah, Gail and Rachel. And they had and there's also Sandra Jo and her partner who lived nearby, and they didn't have land, so they were kind of camped out in a dreary piece of city land next to the Boeing parking lot, but they were very inspirational to us as well. There was also really big anti-nuclear actions on the West Coast at that time, big actions in California at nuclear plants, and so we kind of picked up a continuous thread of activity that spans sort of the anti-nuclear movement, and then moved into for us it was the feminist anti-militarist campaigns, and then it kind of a lot of us moved into doing Central America work, and then many of us also worked with ACT UP when ACT UP was starting. And then, just for the fun of it, a lot of times we just did stuff. And Jen, Jody, and I could probably tell you lots of stories about just spontaneous activities. Like, we'd find out that some homophobic guy was speaking at a library in town, and we'd go and make sure he know that we didn't like that. So I feel reticent to name names. But my closest friend here in Seattle that I still see every week, I met in jail at the Women's Pentagon Action. Her name's Allison. A lot of the women I met in jail in the Pentagon Actions were part of the Boston Women's Peace Camp. They were part of a group called Boston Women's Pentagon Action, and then they became involved in the Boston Women's Peace Camp effort. At some point there was a split that the Women's Pentagon Action Boston was doing a lot of work to organize the first peace camp, and then they decided they wanted to pull back and do less work. And so then I was living in Boston at that time. I split off from them and started a separate Boston Women's Peace Camp movement. And so we were doing a lot of fundraising in Boston and New York and in New England to raise money for a peace camp. And I remember we had a big fundraising event at a church in downtown Boston. It raised tons of money for peace camp effort. I remember getting up on the pulpit and speaking, and by that time we had some video footage we were showing of Greenham Common and stuff like that. So there was a lot of energy around the first year of peace camp and getting it going. The women who made have you seen the video Stronger Than Before? So that whole group of women, Barbara Schulman, I'm not great with names after all this time. Yeah.
Claire Beach, they were all part of that.
Yeah.
And then a lot of people you probably wouldn't know because they were, active for a year or two and kind of came into peace camp for a couple of actions, and that was it.
Right.
I have letters, though. I have letters from a lot of those people.
Did you have any idea as you started this idea of, let's go to the Seneca Army Depot, local place, the hugeness that it would become in terms of capturing sort of international and national attention?
Well, it was our vision to do exactly that.
What?
So we were inspired by what was happening at Greenham Common. We were inspired by this tiny little peace camp out here in Puget Sound, and there were there was an organization in Philadelphia willing to front $5,000 to set up a peace camp, and I think we really at that point wanted to make sure that they had the local groups involved, so we could help them choose. There were a couple of options that they were considering about where to have it, and they got very interested in Seneca because we'd been doing actions there. So we wanted to really influence that. We wanted to, we knew a lot of these women because, again, they'd been involved in Women's Pentagon Action, or they'd been involved in some of the other, there was a circuit of women and you ran into them a lot. So there were people from War Resisters League, people from, people from our little upstate Feminist Peace Alliance. We were probably the smallest of the groups involved, and we knew enough about each other politically because we've been involved in these actions in New York and other places. So we, we basically came together and formed this coalition of people to really focus as much attention as we could on the continued attention, because it was really part of what we'd been doing. But the idea of having a whole summer of activities and having waves of people come and kind of try to keep that discussion alive for a whole long period of time was pretty visionary, and it wasn't something we'd ever done before. Everything else had been a 1 or 2 day thing, and but we knew from the 2 times that we'd been forced into longer activities, like nobody expected us to have to be in jail for 10 days at the first Women's Pentagon Action, or for those women who were in jail for 30 days, the second one. We knew that we could mobilize long-term support around that kind of thing, and we knew that we could sustain something over time. We'd been working together for a couple of years at that point, so we and we had this incredible vision. We really, and we were pissed off. I mean, we really did not want to have this stuff going on in our backyard. We had ongoing concerns, long concerns about the whole project of the nuclear warfare, the missiles, what they could do, how they could destroy people but leave buildings intact. We had a lot of concerns about those dangerous times, really.
Before, had you had civil disobedience training?
We were all civil disobedience trainers. Like that's some of what the folders over there are. Like my notes, I noticed I have notes from what I used to speak on during the trainings. We gave a lot of civil disobedience trainings at that time to people who were getting involved in various actions with us. We had borrowed from the anti-nuclear movement the affinity group model, and there were lots of people, especially the women in New England, this group I was talking about, Women in Life on Earth. They had a lot of experience with the affinity group model. They had been involved in different anti-nuclear activities where the affinity group model had been used, and so that just seemed really natural to us. Consensus decision making also seemed like the right thing to do as feminists, and there were lots of people, I think Karen Beadle among them, who came out of a Quaker background, and so we had a lot of people with experience with consensus decision making and having that work. So we tried to live by those values and principles as we were doing all of our organizing and all of our efforts. I have lots of letters back and forth from people who would complain it wasn't really working, that people's egos would get involved, or somebody really wasn't following the right process or something. There was a lot of political back and forth and discussion about it, but ultimately I think it really it did work. And for the women who came who had not experienced that before and had not seen what was possible, we were already kind of living this vision that they were aspiring to, and they were like, wow, how, they were just dumbfounded that you could actually live that way, that you could try to live by your values that way, that you could try to have those kinds of discussions where you hear everybody out, even if it goes on till 2 or 3 in the morning, that women could do that. Again, it was super empowering for a lot of people to see that.
I was one of those women.
Yeah, there was a lot of people who.
Our lives.
Yeah.
The work that you all did made huge differences. Once you come into it and see it, you do aspire to it. You have to have it. You have to be there. You want to get there. You may not be practiced at it, but it's that's the direction you want to go in, A lot of us were really young, so we did vision big time. Not all of us were, though, and I was looking in my notes from that time, and I
I saw that we had even created this kind of two-tiered sense of some women who were older and had been involved in political activities and political organizations for longer, and they were kind of had more deeper experience with kind of mobilizing campaigns, and then those of us who were a little less experienced in that area, and there was a lot of give and take. There was a lot of what I'd call erotic power also, with a lot of women who had been, we were in this place that was kind of right when the gay liberation movement had sort of started to move downward. Feminism was kind of on the upswing, and there were lots of lesbians who really wanted to connect with each other and didn't know how, were feeling the same senses of frustration, of inability to be who we wanted to be within society. Society didn't welcome us at all, and so there was a lot of that kind of erotic power fueling a lot of the really young women who were involved in peace camp. Now, it wasn't completely all a lesbian movement, but there were these amazing amounts of kind of connections and undercurrents going on in the background because of that. And it was also a place where we could be out and safe and outrageous and basically be who we were. And in the rest of society at that time, we couldn't really be who we were. We still hadn't reached any kind of a ability to walk down the street holding hands without people throwing stones at us or attacking us for one thing or another. So when we were together in force, we could be who we really wanted to be. And our vision of who we wanted to be and who we thought we could be is actually how we get to be today. 25 years later, we helped create this reality that I live in today, where I'm out at work, my friends, it's not even a thought on their mind that there's anything strange or wrong or odd about being a lesbian or a gay person. And we had to create that reality for ourselves back then, and we did. And because we could, that was an amazing thing about Peace Camp, was that because we insisted on it being a women's only movement, we really were able to kind of do everything using the power and empowering other women and all of that. And that part of our vision really worked. It really helped make a lot of women who went there that year a lot stronger. It helped them understand that they could do things that they didn't think that they could do. It's interesting. I think that we didn't all agree that men were bad and evil and created nuclear weapons, and women were good and beautiful and created peace. But it kind of got played out that way for some people. But I think what we were really trying to do was create a safe place where women could become empowered and understand how to act and become an activist and kind of carry on a vision. And we knew that we had to make that happen for other women, because the society we lived in wasn't going to make that happen. And we realized that we could make that happen. We were in some of these intense situations, like the Women's Pentagon Action, where we were all jailed together for 10 days. We didn't have any choice. There were just, the 43 women that were in that container together for all that time, and that really gave us a lot of energy to kind of keep moving and keep on doing that kind of work. And then we met people out in the world. We'd see them in ones and twos in different places that we'd go that were trying really hard to kind of live out in open lives, or to be very vocal about their opposition to Reagan or opposition to the nuclear arms race. And we really wanted to make a place where people could kind of come together collectively and make a very big and powerful statement, and we did that. We were we were able to pull it off.
Can you talk a little bit about the transition from organizing to the camp to the time it actually started, what that was like for you when women showed up and it opened?
Well, I myself was under a big transition because I moved from Rochester to Boston during that time, and yet was kind of very connected to my roots.
Yeah.
And there were lots and lots of meetings. I think we met monthly at different places in New York. We met in New York, we met in Connecticut, we met, I forget where else we met, but there were lots of different meetings where we got together and kind of, what was this going to be like? What was our position on men? Were we going to keep men completely off the land, or were we going to have some kind of, men's auxiliary role? Lots and lots of different debates about that. This whole thing about theme weeks, should every week build upon a theme, and how were we going to keep women coming all through the summer? We planned on having these kind of big presents at the opening, and we planned on having a big march in August, but what was going to keep people coming through the whole summer, those kinds of questions. So I just remember that being a kind of whirlwind of activity, because we had this very beautiful statement that people worked on collectively. I think it was almost an afterthought. We had to have some kind of statement that we gave on that day. And I remember we kind of got Grace Paley to help out, because she had written most of this Women's Pentagon Action Vision Statement. And we drafted a bunch of stuff, and I think we kind of gave it to her, and she wordsmithed it a little bit, but by the end of it we had this really kind of very powerful statement about our vision to read on the opening of the camp. And I don't think we really envisioned the first day of Peace Camp to be like this big deal. We knew we were going to have a big march later that summer, but a lot of energy started to grow around the opening of the camp, and it sort of started to become a big deal, and we kind of, with our great sense of humor, decided to open it on July 4th, because it was this big patriotic day, and this was a sign of how we felt, how big a statement we felt we could make about this great American holiday or whatever. And we had no idea that there was going to be a big controversy then about flying the flag and all that sort of stuff. And those people got really worn out in that discussion. I remember going on and on about using the consensus decision-making process around that. But by that time, there was a lot of us could not care less what happened with the flag thing. It was, I think Carolyn and a few others went over and just endless 2 days of meetings about that. And then I was on the little group of people rushing off to write the vision statement, because we had to have like some great statement to prepare at the gates. And then there was this whole thing like, who's going to read the statement? So they picked me to read the statement because I was sort of local, and also I'd been involved in writing it, and really, that was my thing. I was a writer, and I wanted to make sure that we had the right words. And so everybody kind of took a different, there were other women who wanted to make sure we had the right gestures, what was the right symbol to attach to this, and so they, came up with the symbols and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, there was a lot of activity leading up to that opening.
And did you stay at the camp for that summer? Did you just go back and forth for?
No, I went back and forth. I had a day job, so I had to work it. I had originally thought that I would apply for a full-time, there were a couple full-time jobs I think that first summer we supported. I mean, not high-paying jobs, but just enough to kind of get by on, a couple $100s or something. And I think I had initially applied for one of those jobs, or thought that I might apply for one of those jobs, and there was some kind of political back and forth, and some people in Boston got mad at me because of how I handled something, and then I got mad at them, so I withdrew my application for the job and didn't end up actually working there. And I'm kind of glad of that, actually. It probably would have been too much for me. The larger Peace Camp got, and the more kind of anarchistic individuals that began to congregate there, the harder it got for those of us who had been engaged early on with a really strong sense of mission and action and purpose. And I think some of the folks that came to Peace Camp just seemed really out there to me. And others of them were, like I remember this whole contingent from Minneapolis that came and stayed for a week, and they did an action every day, and they were the most, in fact, my best friend's sister was in that group, and they were really organized, and they brought all their own food. And but you know, then we had people who would show up with no money, no food. Yeah, so it was, when it got into that more and more intense mix of people that I didn't quite know anymore, it was harder and harder to go to Peace Camp and connect. It was almost like in order to go to Peace Camp and connect with people at that point, you had to kind of go there as a new person every single time. And I think also, I think a lot of us got really burnt out. So I think we had a meeting after the first year about, because we never really thought about what we were going to do with Peace Camp after that first year, and we had a meeting, and we tried to decide what kind of influence if any, we should have in an ongoing way. And I know by then I just sort of just phased out of Peace Camp, and didn't actually care. I felt like the energy that was there should continue to be whatever that energy was. And a bunch of us went back and did many protests. I think I went back twice the following year. I know I got arrested a second time. I got arrested the first time on August 1st, and went back the second year, and we also got arrested at Peace Camp at the main gate. So I know I continued to be involved with Peace Camp, but not in the, it was almost like after I handed off the financial reports of that first year, and felt like I came to a really good sense of closure for myself. I was very willing to pass it on to the next group of folks that wanted to put their energy into it. Actually had way more fun the second year than the first year, probably because I wasn't as responsible or involved. And I just remember us having a blast at Peace Camp that second year with all these women, and laughing and goofing a lot, and getting arrested. And I think Barbara Deming had died, and there was a memorial, and so we were able to have more fun, I think, the more we let go of the responsibility of it. The first year was kind of crazy, you know, it really got big, it really spiraled out of everybody's control, but it was also really, really exciting. I mean, and the things that we would hear that were happening when, you know, these amazing conversations that were happening between the local people and the Peace Camp women at that little truck stop restaurant, and the, you know, the women who came forward from the town of Seneca and Waterloo, and said that they also agreed with what was going on, but they, of course, you know, came all dressed up in kind of local outfits and wanted to make sure that they were women, whereas we were WYNYNs or whatever we were at the time. And I've met a lot of people. I've met, Ruth works with someone who grew up in that town, and has a perspective of what it was like to be a teenager when that was all happening. And a lot of people in the area were actually initially against what we were doing, and then eventually kind of came to agree with us as it became more and more apparent that we weren't a bunch of crazies, and they really were storing nuclear weapons there, and that probably wasn't a very safe place for them to be stored. And they really didn't have any interest in supporting the local community beyond dumping stuff there. So we had an incredible impact, and we changed a lot of people's minds about militarism and about nuclear weapons in particular. I saw members of my family become really, change their minds about militarism after listening to us and watching what happened. And there were a lot of people that were extremely, extremely moved by what happened when the march through Waterloo got, you know, basically threatened at gunpoint, and you know, the only resolution was to arrest the women instead of the townspeople, which was absolutely the most ridiculous response that they could have made. It got us way more headlines than anything. But the kind of really intense homophobia and anti-Semitism, and you know, that kind of super redneck response that came out during those days was really swayed a lot of people's minds, and got us way more people to come up there on August 1st than we would have gotten otherwise. I mean, that really motivated people to come out and support Peace Camp and make sure that we knew that not everybody living around there were like those people, and they certainly weren't anti-Semitic. And
I was there in the 90s, so when the depot was closing down, somebody came to the door, medals across his chest, knocked on the door, "You never saw me," and handed us a tape. And it was a tape of the arrests of all the women who, on those Minnesota, buses.
oh yeah,
All right, so there they all are, one after another, in being processed.
well, the surveillance was incredible. I mean, they had incredible surveillance. It was at times very intimidating and frightening, and especially those of us who knew that we were leaders and had been identified as such. And so I remember my worst fear about the second year getting arrested at Peace Camp, which was way greater than even the first year, was that I had, you know, I was publicly known. I had given the opening speech. I, you know, had been on national television. They knew who I was. It wasn't like the rest of my affinity group where, you know, and because we knew they had tapes like that, right? So they did incredible things. Like the first year, right when Peace Camp opened, you know, we had this whole ritual where people would come. It was like an onboarding process, right? Where when women would first arrive at the camp, we would kind of filter them into. We had a set list of things that they needed to do, because we needed to understand that there were rules to the land, not heavy capital R rules, but we need to orient them to consensus decision-making process. We need to orient them toward affinity group process. We need to orient them to the principles of nonviolence. We had to orient them to passive resistance, and so you may remember these, but we would have these workshops pretty much on a daily basis. And when we started, when we were opening Peace Camp, and God, especially during that August 1st, they would bring helicopters in, and they would hover right over, like really 15 feet above the big circle where we'd be giving the training. It was, you know, classic intimidation tactics. But you know, for all their surveillance, it was remarkable to me the number of times. There were several stealth operations that the Peace Camp women did on the depot. So there was this one great group of women that came there, and in the dark of the night, they climbed over the fence and they went up on the water tower and actually painted on the water tower. It's like, how the hell did they get away with that if they were really doing some heavy-duty surveillance on us, right? That was hilarious. And you know, the most amazing thing we ever did was, well, not the most amazing thing, but the remarkable thing we did was to buy land with a fence adjacent to the depot. I mean, how lucky was that? I remember at the time, you know, there were lots of women that were very upset and concerned about, you know, how can we be property owners? You know, and the rest of us were just sitting there going, my God, you know, Greenham Common was on a common land, and the rest of us sitting going, this is America. We're going to do it the American way. We're going to buy our Army depot. You know, we're going to buy property, and we'll just see what they can do about it then. So the fact that that was just a major exciting coup, that we were actually able to buy that land so that they couldn't control us. We were now private property owners, and we could build the camp. You know, they could throw all kinds of rules on us like they did about how we had to have the porta potties, and you know, I actually got a organization, a foundation that would give money to Peace Camp, but only to fund, they had to fund something specific, like they had to fund a utility. So they funded our porta potties for $7,000 or something like that. I don't know, it's in the records. So that was pretty cool. But they would come and walk along the fence with their infrared stuff, and you know, I'm sure that there was lots of great opportunities for them to test new surveillance equipment on what was going on at the camp. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they had those tapes. In fact, I remember them taping when we were being arrested. Aware of that, we didn't ever want to have any kind of professional spokesperson. You know, that's partly why I think I got chosen to give that speech at the opening day. Was I was kind of an anonymous, every woman type person who, you know, it wasn't going to be somebody like, you know, when August 1st happened and we actually got some national people who had national prominence, like when Grace Paley was up there, or Bella, no, but also Sonia Johnson.
Oh yeah.
They all try very hard to focus, the media focus in on those personalities, and the personalities themselves were really great at keeping quiet about who they were and what was going on. And we saw that at Pentagon Action too. The only person they could identify as being any kind of leader was Grace. So the cameras just hovered around Grace Paley, and then she would just kind of, you know, point their direction elsewhere. But that was exactly how we felt. There was no prominent persona. We didn't want their right. And it was and it really was a kind of sense of collective action and leaderless, you know. I feel today that I'm not sure I agree with that anymore. You know, that I feel like if I have to think about the one thing that Peace Camp didn't do, was it didn't produce it didn't allow us the opportunity to produce leaders or grow kind of leaders. What we grew was kind of a collective sense of consensus. And I think today I'm much more interested in empowering women in such a way that we do build leaders. Because I think a lot of what we did was people became afraid to take responsibility or to kind of take charge, or there were times when even myself, I was very hesitant to be accused of being on some kind of ego trip when I actually had a message that I could have been giving or something. And ultimately, I think some of us were disempowered by the fact that we couldn't move anymore as individuals. In fact, a lot of us left and went to places where we could kind of grow away from that kind of whole collective sense of. So there's a point at which I think that collective stuff will if you need to grow beyond it, it can actually become really discouraging. We didn't do a good job at that. You know, we just kind of said Peace Camp is what it is, and you know, whatever actions you want to take as an individual, it's up to you, or if you want to do it as a group or an affinity group, it's up to you. But we didn't really help people with what a vision beyond what we'd create. It was almost like, this is what we've created, this is the vision, and you know, that whole question of where do you go next or what do you do next was just left unanswered.
Yeah.
Well, I think there were different aspects to spirituality. I mean, there were plenty of women at that time who were kind of playing around with paganism or, you know, different kind of new religions or new sense of spirituality that women could kind of share together. There was also someone from Women's Pentagon Action who went into rabbinical school, you know, so, and I know Andrea went to Harvard Divinity School, so there were lots of women who had a sense of spirituality, or, you know, there was lots of witchcraft-like activities going on, pagan activities. But did Peace Camp itself have a strong spiritual bent? Not any more than this kind of connection of women to environmentalism and a sense, that sort of sense. I think there were many differences of opinion, though, and you'd find that there were some really deep-oriented, spiritually oriented women there. Some of us, though, like I remember having a problem with that kind of women are closer to nature than men argument, or somehow women are innately more or naturally more bent toward peace or toward, nature. I come from much more of a social constructionist position, so I don't really believe that I'm necessarily closer to nature or more spiritual than the next person. But I wouldn't say that I'm not a spiritual person either, and we certainly did a lot of spiritually oriented stuff at Peace Camp and other places. But I know as organizers we had an understanding and a commitment, and we shared a sensibility around what was nonviolent, and we had a history around that in terms of really, probably 10 years experience working in nonviolent movements and understanding and believing in the philosophy of passive resistance, that nonviolent, that basically the arrests were symbolic, post-arrest, that the best way to act in those situations, since the arrest was a symbolic act anyways, was passive resistance, not fighting back. And that's what we taught. That was a philosophy we had. That's how we taught it. It was about de-escalation of violence. It was really crystal clear from all the trainings. We'd done many trainings and been in many actions in which we knew that people who fought back, who resisted, would get hurt, and we didn't want anyone to get hurt, especially not for what was ultimately a kind of symbolic act. Now, there's lots of debates about what I'd call the gray area, is defacing public property non-violent or violent. I mean, then we let people make their own decisions about that, right. But we certainly weren't advocating defacing of any property. We didn't even want people to cut the chain link fences at the depot. We wanted them to go up and over the fences, because we basically didn't want people to get sued for property damage or activities that would be considered criminal activities as opposed to symbolic, nonviolent activities. Certainly bringing any kind of weapon onto the land would have been completely out of the question. Right. And those, we invited people in, and we invited these different actions in. We also told them what the principles are and the principles that we advocated, and it was pretty clear if they didn't follow those principles that we couldn't be responsible for their action. Peace Camp was a political, well-organized political encampment with lots of vision, lots of philosophy. I wouldn't call the people seasoned veterans or anything, because we're all like 22 years old, but we had enough time, we had time and experience, and like I said, there were some women who were not as young as we were, who were also very experienced in nonviolent protest activities, and we really valued and took a lot of their advice on these kinds of things. So yeah, we did have a strong sense of what we thought was violent versus nonviolent, and we knew we would have to maintain a kind of code around that, or else we would get, people would get hurt. We'd get, treated like violent protesters were treated, and we didn't want tear gassing, we didn't want any of that kind of you know, stuff to happen.
Right.
Be great for news headlines, but would suck for a long-term, ongoing, permanent encampment that we wanted to, where we wanted to maintain an ongoing, permanent presence against the military activity. And I know there were tons of problems later on, and actually wasn't very interested in being on the land when those kinds of problems, you know, came up with people who were, as you said, being told to go there to learn something, or even the women who went there and then decided to more violently protest their arrests or something like that. It wasn't what we were about. And I'm not against defacing public or private property. Myself personally have done it. I'm not sure I'd do it today, and I'm not sure it's the best way. And I actually did some stupid things doing that, you know, because especially when I was younger, I mean, it was just like whatever. Now I think much more holistically about those kinds of activities. And I think if you're going to go deface public property, you ought to have a really good plan about why you're doing it and what it means. And we had lots of fun in Boston defacing these. They'd have these horrible ads of these African American women like on a tiger, kind of having sex with the tiger, and we'd had no problem climbing up on buildings and painting racist and sexist and all kinds of things all over them.
Yeah.
So.
Did a 5-state tour, I think, one time, defacing. What was it? Black Velvet or? Oh, I can't.
Feel the velvet.
Huh?
Feel the velvet.
Yeah, Feel the Velvet.
It's the same idea.
Yeah.
Sexy.
Yeah, we managed. I think we did 5 different states. In one trip, didn't we?
I think so.
You know, the people that we studied, right, were people like Barbara Deming. I don't know if you've read her. You've probably read her work. I mean, she's a total pacifist. So we weren't modeling ourselves against, and those were our feminist four sisters. You know, that's who we modeled ourselves against. We didn't model ourselves against people who were other than kind of sharing these values that we had.
Yes.
And I don't think we had big aspirational goals of shutting down the depot or anything like that. It was really, we thought that might happen in the long term, mostly because it was a really hard location, I think, for them to store that stuff in. And as soon as we started drawing attention to it, I think the risk of having stuff in that location just got greater and greater and greater. But, you know, I think that from the beginning, these protests were understood to be very symbolic, and continuing to draw attention to this, what we thought was a very important issue. And Reagan was terrible. I mean, it was 8 years of this disgusting Republican president who, you know, if you'd been around in the Carter years, it was this dramatically big turnaround on the national political scene. So we felt like we were in big trouble with who was in government and in power at that time. And it wasn't anything we had known growing up either, because, you know, we grew up with the benefits of the Carter administration and national public policy that was education positive and stuff like that, and suddenly, you know, we have this big militarist president, and all the kinds of freedoms that we had gotten from the Carter administration were really being basically cut off. Welfare cut off, you know, any kind of positive program. So, you know, we felt threatened in every way.
You all did a great job. I think I'm running out of
Questions?
well, it's not, there are still lots of questions. It's that my brain is not functioning and grabbing onto. There are so many things. When I went outside, I had a bunch of, oh, I want to find out about that and that. And then I lost it when I came in, you know. But I get more and more amazed the more information we hear from women. The more, I think it was an enormous phenomena.
Well, I think what was really cool about it is that, you know, a lot of people's lives, a lot of women's lives were changed by their experience at Seneca.
Yeah.
And I don't think that I was one of them, because my life had already been changed by what I had gone through the 2 years prior to that. And what I thought was really cool about Seneca, though, was that we were able to kind of spread that out across and influence so many people.
Yeah.
And that we also actually were able to bring focus on a national scale to what was going on at the Army Depot. I mean, my parents went to Boston that weekend and saw me on national television. And we had no idea that national television would even pick up this small little activity. We certainly didn't know it would grow into what it grew into, and as you know, there was a state of emergency called in New York State on the weekend of August 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, which was the big march that we had. And so to have had that much power and influence, and then to see what happened that first year at Peace Camp, where women came to Peace Camp and suddenly just got it. You know, they got super empowered by what was going on there. They got, they made connections. They understood ways of thinking that they hadn't understood before. You know, the stuff that we'd been kind of living the past 3 years, and we kind of already got it. So we didn't have to stay at Peace Camp to get that anymore. We kind of had to go on and do other things and get involved in other kinds of movements and things. But it was just incredible to see what we were able to accomplish by providing that space and that opportunity and mission, you know, and vision. And that's probably the most unforgettable thing about the whole Peace Camp movement to me, was the vision that we had, and the fact that we were actually able to accomplish a large part of what we envisioned, you know. And like I said, I'm sad that our vision didn't go beyond the creation of Peace Camp, you know, that we were so unsure that we were even going to be able to create Peace Camp and that anybody would even come. We didn't really think beyond that, you know. We're just like, well, what do we do now? And, you know, people were like, well, let's shut it down. Well, we can't shut it down. There's all these people who are just starting to get interested because of what we created. So we, you know, the one thing I'd say is that maybe our vision wasn't big enough, you know, that we didn't think of it as more than that one summer of activity when we were first organizing. So.
Yeah. Hershey, do you have any other questions? And it's, when you just taking it in, it's almost like you need time to digest it all and to go to hear again the kinds of things. Thank you so much for doing this interview.
Sure.
And thank you so much for the work that you did. I know that I have met hundreds, if not thousands, of women who are still affected and who have taken from their experiences at the camp into their everyday lives. And
well, we had the right we were filling the right need at the right time for a lot of women. There was, like I said, it was a very unusual time in that the government had just changed to be a pretty repressive government. We were at the just burgeoning moments of what was kind of a women's cultural moment where women were coming out of the closet in droves. We had this amazing, you know, powerful political message that we truly believed in. And we had the opportunity, you know, we had a kind of global mission of looking at the women's peace camp movement as it had started in England and really thinking, wow, we can spread this message. This can be not about national boundaries or local events. This really can be an international, we can participate in an international movement, we can change lives, and we can really have an impact on the future. And we did all of that, and we made some amazing predictions that came true. You know, we predicted that they'd close the depot down, and they did. We predicted that the country in general would become disenchanted with the nuclear arms race. That certainly happened, although, you know, we have this whole other big military buildup right now. We also believed in a future for women that was really different from the future, the reality that we lived in, and a lot of that came true, and we helped to make that happen. And we also envisioned, for those of us who were, you know, living as pretty oppressed lesbians at that time, we envisioned a world in which we could live who we were and be who we are, and, you know, that we helped make that happen as well. So it was incredible to be part of that and be so young and be so righteous, you know, that we had the right to be that way, to live our lives that way, and we were gonna do that. And, you know, I don't think we were thinking about making a better or bigger future for anyone that strongly, but in fact, you know, it's amazing to look at the times we live in today and see the kinds of freedoms that people have, and not think back on when, you know, I personally didn't have any of that in my 20s. You know, and so here we are today, and it's kind of a better place to live. And I think that a lot of the stuff that was going on at Peace Camp, although we had this mission and we had a focus on anti-militarist activity, there was a whole cultural movement that we were also fueling, and people were really drawn to that. They were, and say lesbians came to Peace Camp, felt free, felt like they could make decisions for themselves, felt empowered. The whole message of empowerment really worked. The way that we talked about it with people, the way we asked people to really understand and envision themselves in a different way and act in that way while they were at Peace Camp, that was a super thing to give to people. And, you know, when my friends all go to Burning Man now, right? And if you talk to these guys who went to Burning Man in the first years of Burning Man, and you know what, Burning Man's not so great as it was in those first years and all that, I always think it's a lot like Peace Camp, you know, that they have these, you know, collective experiences there. No political mission. I don't know why, but they don't. But sometimes when people come back and tell me those Burning Man stories, I kind of think, oh yeah, Peace Camp. It was kind of like that. So, well, it's just a small part of my life, but it was a fun part. I mean, I think it's fun now. I think back then I was just tortured by all the politics and all the decisions and the backbiting, and, you know, people that were your friends one day and your enemies the next day because who knows why you had a slightly different take on something in a meeting.
Yeah.